It's Mo. It is January 2023. It's January 8th, and I have finished one book so far in January. That means it's time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. This is where I talk about the books that I'm reading in the month. I talk about them once I've completed them, and I talk about them for about 5 minutes. I give you my thoughts and feelings on them, and hopefully this is helpful for you when you are looking for new books to read. The first book that I finished in January is Chosen by the Lion by Gregg. This is a poetry book that was written in the 90s that I found in a little free library at the end of December 2022. It has a lot of themes of Gregg's relationships. She was obviously involved with a married man, and so this book is kind of talking a little bit about their love affair, about her feelings towards that love affair, about the ending of that love affair, perhaps, but it's all couched in various metaphors and representations of gods, goddesses, Roman times, of a lot of talk of like Aphrodite and different of the Roman gods, and then as well as talking about a larger concept of God. This poetry collection is also a little bit of a travel journal where Linda talks about different places that she's visited, especially in Greece and Italy, and the historic connection with the Roman gods, as well as her connections and relationships. It's an interesting collection. It took me a long time to get into, and it took me a long time to read. A lot of the poems are long and heavy and solid, and those aren't usually my favorite kind of poems. Usually my favorite kinds of poems are very, very short stanzas, short poems in general, but with a particular punch. This one I found myself liking more of the long but thin poems, if that makes sense. More of the poems that were long but not overly dense with the conversations about mythology and religion. The way I like to read poetry is to go through a poetry collection, read the first few poems that catch my eye, no matter what they are. They could be long, they could be short, they could be the first poem, they could be the last poem, but I like to read the ones that first capture me first. Then I like to go through and kind of read the shortest next poems that capture me, so on and so forth, until I reach kind of the longest poems that I've been putting off reading through the collection. And then what I've started doing, which I really enjoy, is going back and annotating the poems that I enjoyed. So picking out the specific lines that I really liked, or the passages that I enjoyed, the things that really struck me about each poem. And in this poetry collection, there were actually a few poems that I just highlighted the title of the poem because I enjoyed the entire poem and the poem as a whole. A lot of times when I'm reading poetry, certain lines will attract me to that poem, but I don't necessarily love or understand the entire poem. That's why I kind of like to go back and annotate them. If it's a poetry collection that I'm going to keep. If it's a poetry collection that I know that I'm not going to keep, I don't bother to annotate it. I sometimes just take a picture of my favorite poems to have and to keep, and then I will eventually unhaul that book. This book, when I first started reading it, I definitely thought I would be unhauling, but as I read through it more and as I reread some of the poems, I ended up really, really enjoying this collection. I also like that many of the pages were dog-eared at the top when I got the book, which to me means that someone else also enjoyed this poetry book and marked those pages as poems that they liked. So it was interesting to see how much the poems they liked and the poems that I liked overlapped. And it was very interesting that they overlapped very little. So that was the first book that I read in January. It is January 12th, and I've finished 2 more books in January. I finished Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the second book in the Southern Reach trilogy. The first book is Annihilation, which I read in 2022, and it blew my mind. I loved Annihilation so much. Annihilation is about a team of scientists who are from the Corporation of the Southern Reach, who are investigating this possibly natural, possibly supernatural, possibly other natural phenomenon that has happened that has created a border over part of the southern coastline. This is the 12th expedition, and we follow the biologist on this expedition in Annihilation and what she discovers crossing the border into the Area X, which is this contaminated coastline. In Authority, we are back at the Southern Reach research facility, and we are following a new director that is coming in. John is having to take over from the director who is missing and come into a fairly disheveled and disorganized organization that has lost its leader. So John is from a government branch, and he has been instructed to take over the Southern Reach. He has been instructed to take over for the director, and he has to go into Southern Reach, meet the assistant director, who is very, very loyal to the past director, and all of the scientists, linguists, and people who are working to understand Area X and understand what this phenomenon is. As the title would suggest, Authority, it's much more about the bureaucracy of Southern Reach. It's much more about the goings-on and workings from the government and the military about Area X. It's much more about political intrigue of the Southern Reach facility, but it is also a scary horror just like Annihilation. Which I thought was amazing. I had no idea what to expect, so I thought it was amazing that Authority and Annihilation had such a similar tone, even though they take place in wildly different environments. My friend who lent me the book, which is why I don't have a physical copy at the moment, had mentioned that Authority was much, much slower than Annihilation, and while I think that the book was longer, I don't actually think it was slower. I actually wonder if Jeff Vandermeer, beat for beat, made the same book, but with different things happening and different people involved. Because to me, Authority felt almost the exact same pace as Annihilation. So you are meeting John, you're meeting our main character, you're finding out about his background in snippets, things are happening, weird things, you're finding out about this kind of government oversight that's happening to John and to Southern Reach, you're finding out about the military involvement, you're finding out about all these machinations, and the whole time you're also worried about the creeping horror that is Area X. I adored this book as well. I also was lucky enough to receive the third book in this trilogy for Christmas. My dad got me a used copy, so I will be continuing on with Acceptance at some point. I definitely had questions about both Annihilation and Authority, and Authority left me with so many unanswered questions and so much confusion as a reader that I wasn't sure exactly what happened, what was going on. And I loved that about Annihilation, and in Annihilation, I definitely felt that I could leave it as it was. I didn't need to know the answers. That was part of the horror. But in Authority, I have questions. So if you've read Authority, definitely let me know in the comments below. And that was the second book that I read in January so far. The third book that I read in January is On Chisel Beach by Ian McEwan. This is a very short novel that I first saw on Bob the Booker. I had never heard of this book before. I saw it on Bob's Booker, I marked it on my want to read, and then like 2 days later I found a copy in a little free library. I feel like that happens a lot, and if you ask the book gods for a book, they will bring it to you. On Chisel Beach is about a couple, and it takes place all on their wedding night. They have been together for about a year, and they've gotten married, and now they're at their honeymoon hotel, and the whole book takes place over that one night, basically, in their honeymoon hotel. But as you read, you see flashbacks to how they got together, to their childhoods, to their own families, and how they were raised. You see why they connected to each other and what their struggles as a couple are. And ultimately this book is about their love for each other, but them not being able to overcome the struggles that they both face individually and are not willing to talk about with each other. I really like this book. It's definitely very flowery. It's definitely very purple prose. It's very like British, and it deals with a lot of heavy topics. I mean, it leaves you kind of wondering why these two people couldn't communicate, and partly because this does take place in the early 60s. That is part of the reason. Time and place is part of the reason, but also I think there's like an underlying conversation about how men and women differ in their communication styles, and ultimately about how society places restraints on men and women, but those restraints are different restraints and expectations. I liked how real this felt and how much it really did feel like being inside a man and a woman's head. It felt very natural, and it felt very much like true experience. But I also do think that it was a little bit through a man's perspective, and a lot of the heart of this novel is how women are perceived and how expectations that are put on them destroy their selfhood and their personality and their responsibility to themselves, how every flaw in a woman is seen as a sickness or a wrongness. There's no benefit or justification or explanation for this, but it is upheld at every turn for women. And while I think this book was an exploration of how difficult that is for a woman and how wrong it is for society to do that to women, it also felt very much through a man's perspective. As a woman reading it, I feel like I could see how this novel could have explored that in a way that said to women that it was normal to feel that way, but that it was unjust of the world to make them feel that way. Whereas I think in this book, it kind of leaned towards the side of society and the side of those injustices. But I would definitely highly recommend this. I've never read any Ian McEwan before, and this didn't make me want to run out and read a bunch of Ian McEwan books, although I'm sure his books are beautiful. The writing in this, although very flowery and purple, was also very compelling, and I enjoyed it. Glad that I read something by this author, and I'm glad that the something that I read was this short novella. And those are all the books that I've read so far in January, but when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is January 16th. It is MLK Day. Happy MLK Day. Go watch or read something about MLK. I have finished 3 more books in January. I finished The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur. I read the first of Rupi Kaur's poetry books in 2022, and I didn't love it, but I found this one in a little free library at the end of the year, and I picked it up. The thing about Rupi Kaur's poetry is that it's extremely short. She's extremely talented for a very young woman, so it's easy to get through. It's interesting. Although I got more out of this book still isn't for me. This is a poetry book for young people, for people new to poetry, and also for just the young experience, I think. I think that in The Sun and Her Flowers, she has grown both a little bit as a poet and in her subject matter. This book, similar to Milk and Honey, is broken up in different sections. I'm not really interested in reading breakup poetry, but some of the poems were interesting. I did note a few of the poems in here, and I will be doing a quick annotation video at some point. But I also won't be keeping this book at the end of the year. If you're new to poetry, and if you like short poetry like I do, I definitely think Rupi Kaur's work is worth checking out. She's obviously extremely talented, and I look forward to continuing my journey reading her books. I don't know if they'll ever be my favorite poetry books, or even poetry books that impact me a great deal. The next book that I finished is Howard's End by E.M. Forster. This is a classic book written in 1910 in England. E.M. Forster is best known for, I believe, this book and probably his book Maurice, which is about a gay man. I started reading Howard's End in 2022, sometime in the summer or fall, and I ended up DNFing it like a little bit over halfway through. Not because I wasn't enjoying it, but because it is a classic work. It has a lot of difficult language, and it's kind of hard to parse out. It's a very slow reading experience, which after reading it for quite some time, I wasn't in the mood for anymore. In January, I always do try to finish a DNF or two from the previous year, and this was the one that I chose. And I'm so glad I did. I really did enjoy it, and I was enjoying it the first time that I read it. Howard's End follows the Shiegels, which are a family who has lost their parents. It's two sisters and a brother. And when we first meet them, Helen, the younger sister, has just accepted an invitation to go down to Howard's End, which is a friend of a friend's house in the country, and she is hanging out there with the family. She's falling in love with the house, and maybe she's falling in love with one of the sons of that family as well. The Wilcoxes have welcomed her, and Paul Wilcox has caught her eye and she has caught his, but their quick enamoration soon disintegrates and Helen goes back to the Shiegels, and there's a little kerfuffle that happens there, but mostly they put them out of their mind. Until several years later, the Wilcoxes move into a temporary apartment across from the Shiegels, and at the same time our main character family are figuring out that they need to leave the house they're currently in, and they're trying to figure out what to do about that. The older sister, Margaret, becomes good friends with Mrs. Wilcox. Unfortunately, Mrs. Wilcox is ill, and this strengthens their bond even more. Margaret soon again becomes kind of embroiled in the family. That's the basic premise of this and how these two families are connected through time, and it's kind of all revolving around Howard's End, which is the Wilcoxes' summer home. By all accounts, Howard's End is quite a magical place. It's got a intensely homey feel, and it comes in and out of these two families' lives often, and sometimes with quite a lot of drama. This book was just very interesting because this is a book where a place is a character. Howard's End is definitely a character. This is a book that talks about wealth discrepancy, the rich and the poor, the underprivileged and the privileged. It talks about women's roles in marriage at the time and bucking those societal norms and expectations to live the life that you want to lead. I thought there were a lot of interesting conversations, some kind of snippets and throwaways, and some very deep that were obviously like the intent of this book, but it was so hard to read a lot of the times. Some of it was the language that was used. It's extremely like silly tongue-in-cheek, but also flowery at the same time. It also had to do with the references that I didn't get for early 20th century England and the countryside. So it was really, really hard. I'm hoping that E.M. Foster's other works are not this difficult. I'm super glad I read it. I definitely want to watch the film. I think there's been several film adaptations, so I would love to see those. It has a lot of humor in it, so I think that probably comes across really well in some of the adaptations. And I definitely want to read more of E.M. Foster's work, but I'm hoping that they're less obtuse. Another book that I finished in January is The Removed by Brandon Hobson. I got this hardback copy in a little free library in Ocean Grove, New Jersey in 2022, and this is an Indigenous American author, so I was really excited to read it. I read this one on audio. As part of my Read What You Own challenge, at least half of the audios that I read each month have to be work that I own physically as well to help pare down my physical TBR. So I was happy to find this one on audio, and I was happy to read it on audio. It's told by multiple narrators. In that way, it reminded me a little of There by Tommy Orange, which I read last year. I really love to hear the Indigenous American accents, and it's nice to have another layer of the experience of reading an Indigenous work, I think. This follows a husband and wife and their 3 children. Very early on, we find out that one of their sons has died at the hands of a policeman at an early age. The beginning of the story is from that past perspective, and then we move into a more current day timeline. It's more than 10 years later, and the family has suffered such hardships and repercussions of their eldest son JJ dying. His younger brother has turned to drugs and is an addict. The family has had multiple interventions for him, but he's not really doing great. He's breaking up with his girlfriend. He's experiencing things that might not be real. JJ's sister is obsessed with the son of the man who killed JJ and uses promiscuous sex with young men to kind of dull her pain over the whole thing. JJ's mother suffers extreme depression, and JJ's father has developed Alzheimer's and memory loss, and we're not sure if that's physically medical or mentally medical. So this book is really interesting. It's just basically the story of this family over like a week, what happens to each member. So you see them many years after JJ's death, and then you kind of find out where in their lives they are, if they're together, if they're apart. I think the thing that I noticed most about it was very similar to a lot of the indigenous works that I've read recently. It had a similar theme to Elotsue, Monkey Beach, and The Only Good Indians, where the melding of Native American culture, history, and spiritual beliefs and the current modern day America are mixed up in our current time period. There are aspects of spirituality that enter into the common day for our characters. There are ghosts, there are monsters, you can have visions, you can see people, people can be reincarnated, but it's all told in the way that this is seemingly normal, understood, and accepted by everyone in the story. So whereas I think especially in Western culture, we would not believe that people could be reincarnated, or we would not believe that you could have visions foretelling tragedy or joy, in these books, that seems to be extremely commonplace and without even thinking. It doesn't seem to be a device of the book. It seems to be true for both the characters and possibly the author. And so it made me want to read more about Native American culture in general, all the different experiences and all the different tribes and all the different communities of people, and see how much that is a common day and plain thing that happens to people, that they have that spiritual side and that they are able to have visions and that they were able to see ghosts and talk to ghosts, because a lot of it seems to be very true, very common, very obvious and easy for people coming from those communities. But I also think it makes for a really interesting reading experience because it doesn't feel like magical realism. It doesn't feel like speculative fiction. It feels like that is the true experience. And so it makes you almost feel kind of untethered from your own reality because your reality doesn't involve that. But obviously reality does have that to a certain extent. There were some aspects of the writing in this that I didn't love. It was very much a book where every single thing that happens, they're telling you what happens. Like, you walk to the door, you turn the doorknob, you open the door, which sometimes can be a little bit frustrating to read. So I would like to read something else by Brandon Hobson and see if that was just a technique for this book or if that's his writing style. I did really enjoy this book, and I can see that a lot of this book kind of went over my head. I think because of the multiple storylines and the different perspectives that I definitely missed some connecting things. And I think actually it could also be that I read it on audio. So I would like to read this book again physically. It's very short. It's under 300 pages. So I think I would like to revisit this one in the not too distant future. Those were 3 more books that I read in January, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is January 20th, and I have read 2 more books in January. I read Warp by Lev Grossman. I had read a chapter of this in a trio chapter in December, and in January I picked it up. I had originally thought that this was a sci-fi novel. I mean, there's, you know, the cover looks like a sci-fi novel, but it wasn't, and I found that out in the trio chapter. It is about a young man, kind of a young aimless man living in Boston. His name is Hollis, and he's really at a loose ends since finishing college, since breaking up with his long-term girlfriend. And this story takes place over a few nights when he hangs out with his friends, when he meets a potential new love interest, when he visits his ex-girlfriend, and just things that aimless, white, 20-something men might do in the 90s. This book is set in the 90s, it takes place in the 90s, and this is the kind of book that I would have loved in the 90s when I was a teenager. I would have thought that this book was so cool. I would have thought that the interspersion of the italic markings of Hollis's inner mind and what he thinks about was cool and innovative and interesting. I would have thought that the inclusion of 90s pop culture references was hip and geared for me as a 90s teenager. But reading it now, it didn't really do it for me. I didn't hate this novel. I liked this novel okay. I liked the little bit of like romance of a aimless, ambitionless young person floating through life and finding people to connect with. And I didn't mind the writing style, although I didn't think it worked on like a literary level. So I don't have too much to say about this one. I liked that it had reference to Star Trek The Next Generation because I love Star Trek The Next Generation. The next book that I finished in January was The Last Conversation by Paul Tremblay. I read this one for the Savage prompts. So Simon Savage and his mother, Louise Savage, picked 13 prompts to do in 2023, one for each month plus a bonus prompt. You will be able to see a recap of my readathons and things that I joined in on for January coming soon. I have started doing readathon recaps again, so each month I will recap what I did in a short video. The Last Conversation is the first Paul Tremblay book I've ever read, and this is an extremely short novella, novelette, or short story in one of those free subscriptions. This is a futuristic story that starts off with a man who is in a hospital room. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know why he's there. And it's all about his interaction with his doctor, who he quickly comes to learn has another relationship to him as well. I can't really say more than that because this is such a short story. I wouldn't want to anyway because this is a book with a little bit of a slow build. I've read another book from this collection, the one by N.K. Jemisin, Emergency Skin, and I really liked that one. I liked the Paul Tremblay one as well. I thought the Paul Tremblay one was a little bit more obvious and a little bit more surface, but at its heart, it's really about the relationship between these two people and how time and distance, sickness, age, and many other factors don't necessarily change who you are or what your opinions are. So I would definitely recommend this one. I think if you're going to read one book from this collection, I would have to recommend the other one, Emergency Skin, but I like this one too. I thought it was also a good introduction to Paul Tremblay's work, and I would like to read more of his books during the year. And those were two more books that I read in January. When I read some more, I'll let you know. It is January 23rd, and I have finished two more books in January. I finished 1,000 Mornings by Mary Oliver. This is a collection of Mary Oliver's poems, and I found it in the little free library. It's very water damaged and kind of gross to read, actually. Mary Oliver is most known for her nature poetry, and this definitely has quite a bit of that in this collection. This collection is formed from many solitary poems that she wrote that were then collected into this edition. So it doesn't feel like it was meant to be all together. They were mostly poems from different magazines and books that came together to be this collection at some point. A lot of the poems do deal with nature and her connection to nature and her observations of nature. I have been hearing about Mary Oliver for a long time, and people say, like, if you're getting into poetry, Mary Oliver is a great person to start with or to turn to, and that her poetry is very approachable, which I would say is true. But she's also known as, like, one of the greatest nature writing poets ever, and I didn't really find that to be so with this particular collection. I thought her nature poems were interesting. There was a few that I really connected with and liked or identified with, but overall this collection didn't blow my mind, and this cross-section of Mary Oliver's writing didn't blow my mind. I definitely would like to try other collections of hers and see if a collection that was meant to be together might have more of an impact. Out of the three poetry books that I've read this month, this one definitely felt the the least cohesive. This didn't feel scattered because all of the poems do have a little bit of like connection to them or a theme to them, but I think that the other collections were like a story or a progression, and this definitely was not like that. The last poem that I read in this, which was not exactly the last poem, but the last one that I read, I didn't cry, but it like brought a tear, you know, like I welled up, I felt it, and I think that primed the pump for me to cry when I finished reading An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. I've been wanting to read this one for a long time though. It won the Women's Prize a few years ago. I read one other book by Tayari Jones, which was a short story, which I really, really liked. An American Marriage is about Celestial and Roy and their friend Andre, who introduces them when they're in college. Celestial and Roy have a tumultuous but passionate love, and they do eventually get married. After being married about a year and a half, having their ups and downs, having fights, making up, they are in Louisiana, where Roy is from, visiting Roy's parents, and they're staying a night at a hotel. In the middle of the night, the police break down the door. They arrest Roy for a crime that he did not commit, and the rest of the book follows what happens through the trial and also the relationship between Celestial, Roy, and their friend Andre, and how that relationship grows and changes over time. So the first part of this book ends with Roy going to prison, and it has a bunch of letters between Roy and Celestial. The next part is from Roy, Celestial, and Andre's perspective, and then so is the last part. I'm not a person who reads the back of books. I don't like to read the synopsis, and although I've read parts of this synopsis, and I know that there are more things that I could tell you that would not be considered spoilers because they are on the back of the book, I would consider them spoilers, and I think that going into this book knowing more than what I wanted to know about this story was a little bit of a hindrance for me. Like, I would have rather gone in a little bit more blind, kind of knowing nothing else except that it was about a married couple and their family and their friends, and how the husband of that couple was falsely accused and imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. I don't love dual perspective or multiple perspective, and one of the reasons that I don't love it is because it's hard to make each character feel very distinct and feel very much their own character. A flaw that I saw with this book and a problem that I had was that the characters, although their stories and their histories are very distinct, their voices when you are reading their chapters are not that distinct. They all kind of sound the same. Does that make sense? Because two of them grew up in Atlanta and one of them grew up in Louisiana. You know, they all grew up around the same time. So maybe it does make sense. I would have liked to have seen more distinct personality coming through. Now, I'm not saying one has to be like, you know, talking in a big accent or something weird like that. I'm just saying that I felt that their stories could have been more clear and their positions could have made more of a connection to the reader if their voices had been more different from each other. Overall, I really, really enjoyed this book. I flew through it. It's extremely fast. It's a little over 300 pages, but the chapters are all very, very short. There are quite a lot of epistolary areas in this. I really like the epistolary parts. I really love epistolary novels in general. I think an interesting part of the epistolary sections of this book is that there are no dates given, so you don't know how long transpires between letters. You don't know how long Roy and Celestial have been separated exactly, which I thought was an interesting idea and an interesting technique. And I think that helped the story kind of progress in a way that it might not have if we had to go like day by day. So at the end of this book, I did cry. It definitely was an emotional read. It never gets like extremely graphic or explicit in its violence, racism, and repercussions of all that. So although Roy goes to prison, and although you do hear some stories of his prison life, you as the reader don't see extremely graphic scenes. I liked that about this book, and I think it could have gone either way. It could have been like extremely gruesome and graphic, or it could have been toned down and accessible the way that it was. I personally find that sometimes the extremely gratuitous and graphic depictions of violence don't help me like a book, and instead just give me nightmares and make me feel horrible, and then you don't remember as much of the book. You only remember those really gratuitous scenes. So I think like some of the violence and some of the devastation in this book might stay with me longer than other books have. But also the book as the whole will, because it didn't go as dark and gruesome as it could have. I definitely want to read more Tayari Jones. I thought Silver Sparrow was her first book, but I actually think that's her third, and there are 2 books that she has before that. Silver Sparrow sounds really interesting, but I think I would also be interested in trying those first 2 books, and I do wonder what she's going to come out with next. I would love to hear what other people think of this one. It wasn't exactly what I expected, so let me know if you've read An American Marriage, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is January 27th, and I have finished one more book in January. I finished Curiosity Thrilled the Cat by Sofie Kelly. I read this for an upcoming Cat Cozy Mystery vlog. This was the second book that I read for that vlog. This takes place in Minnesota, and our main character, Kathleen, has moved from Boston after she broke up with her long-term boyfriend to Minnesota for a change of pace. She's gotten a new job, she lives in a new town, she cut her hair, and she happened to come across 2 young kittens who followed her home in her first weeks living in Minnesota, so she also has a new furry family. Although she gets homesick, she really likes her job, which is why she moved there, and that is renovating and reestablishing the library in Mayville Heights, the small town where she's ended up. The library is a Carnegie library, and she's been updating it and redoing it, putting in computers, but she has run into some struggles. She's had to make all new friends. Her boss is quite imposing. The contractor that has been hired is dragging his feet. When a angry customer comes into the library and she has an altercation with him, that's just one more thing on her list of annoyances. But when that customer, who turns out to be a famous conductor, is found dead by Kathleen the next morning, there's even bigger problems. So this is your very typical cat cozy mystery transplanted to a small town, having to navigate the townsfolk and there being a complete unit and a new person coming in, and then of course when there's a murder she also insinuates herself into the investigation and tries to solve the crime. I like this one. It was pretty fast-paced, easy to read, and although it had some issues that I think a lot of these kind of mass market cozy mysteries have, which often are that they're repetitive, that they have weird jokes that don't really make sense, or like I'm not sure why they're supposed to be funny, while they have too many specific pop culture references that don't make sense after a certain amount of time. This book was written in 2011 and the pop culture references really don't hit anymore, so they're very timely, not evergreen type novels for the most part. But I felt that this one was a little bit more well written, a little bit more compelling, and I thought that the idea of her cats possibly having magic powers was an interesting twist. It could have gone a really bad, silly, overly cliched way, and I think that it was actually quite subtle and interesting and made me want to continue the series. At first I didn't realize that that was going to be part of the story. I guess I should have known because it does say a magical cat's mystery on it. I was kind of glad that I didn't know that going in so that it didn't color my initial reaction to the book. There were a lot of things in this book that were like weird editing issues and editing mistakes, so I wonder if that will happen in other books in this series as well. For instance, there's a scene where Kath is relaxing and someone comes and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking to you on your day off," and then like 1 or 2 pages later she's like, "Well, I have to get to work. It's a work day for me," or whatever. So like there were some weird things that maybe scenes were cut out or days were cut out or plot lines were cut out that the continuity didn't really work, and that happened like 3 or 4 times, which I thought was a little strange. But I do also feel like a lot of these cat cozy mysteries are like, oh, it has to be this certain length, and they edited it out for that, but not necessarily for content, and definitely not for repetition, because there's so much repetition in these, and this one especially. But again, I think that the writing being on a slightly higher level and the background story of the town and how these magical cats fit into the town found being fairly interesting, you were able to put that aside to have a better enjoyment of this book. That is the 11th book that I read in January. The last book that I read in January was Dayworld Rebel by Philip Jose Farmer. This is a classic sci-fi. It was written in the 80s, and it is the sequel to Dayworld, which I read in 2020. I really like Philip Jose Farmer as an author. He's probably most well known for his series called Riverworld, which is another classic sci-fi. Dayworld takes place in a pretty distant future America where the overpopulation and the crime rate, the several new world wars that have gone on, pollution, etc., has caused a extremely strict and restrictive government to not only surveil and watch and keep tabs on every citizen to the most minute detail. Not only has it allowed the government to use a truth spray so that no citizen can lie, this government has also created a system where you only get to live, to be awake, to be a person one day out of each week. So you could be a Monday person, a Tuesday person, a Wednesday person, etc., etc. That's why it's called the Day World, because you live one day a week and then you are stoned, which means that you were basically put into a suspended animation state. Then you wake up the next week on your day. So if you're a Monday person, you wake up every Monday, and the stoning, although like suspended animation doesn't mean that you don't have to sleep, you still have to sleep. So you go to sleep and then you wake up, then you have your day, then you go to sleep, then you wake up at midnight, you get stoned, and the next day, Tuesdays, people all get woken up from being stoned. Dayworld, the first book in the series, follows the main character who is a day breaker. He is able to elude the surveillance and the close examination of the government, and he is able to live every day of the week. But this means that he has to live every day of the week as a different person. He can't be the same person every day. He has to not only act and seem like a new person, he actually has to create and compartmentalize different personalities and people that live each day of the week. Somehow our main character is still able to acknowledge or understand that he's multiple different people, even if he doesn't understand why he's a daybreaker, aside from just not believing what the government is telling him. So in our first book, we learn about our main character, we learn about his daybreaking, and we see why he's doing it. We see what the results of daybreaking could potentially be. We see how he works to discover why he's a daybreaker, why he can split off into multiple different people, and what he's going to do with this information. I don't want to spoil anything for the first book, but in the second book, we meet back up with our character, and he is now a separate and complete eighth person who has no recollection of his previous 7 personalities, predecessors, lives, people that he's been, and he is now held prisoner. So Dayworld Rebel is about him escaping again. Not daybreaking, but breaking out of a facility and going on the run, and kind of the wider implications of that. These books are a lot about not trusting the government, not allowing them to keep you calm, contained, and a cog in the machine. It's about if the government has absolute control, will they absolutely lie to you? It's about what would society do for the common greater good. A big part of especially Dayworld Rebel is talking about how society was prior to the world wars and prior to the current world government taking over and making the world a better place. Is the world a better place? Is constant government interference and oversight the best thing for the planet? And even if it is it worth it if you're not free? This was a really interesting one. This was much shorter than Dayworld, and I think that it was much more politically motivated on the part of the author. I think it was much more about getting the political ideas out into the world than it was about like character development and plot advancement and seeing our main character and other people who he's involved with in a plot-driven story, but I still think it was really interesting. I like the kind of no-nonsense, no-frills writing style in these books and how they're very of their time. Some of the aspects of the future are, you know, obviously already outdated and silly, and also some of the things that could have been seen or would have been seen as like super exciting and innovative are things that we've seen so many times that we know to be like a silly trope or a silly plot device. Even to the point of like when our main character is fighting, you know, a lot of times he'll like chop somebody on the side of the neck and then they'll fall down, you know, passed out and incapacitated. And it's just such a rudimentary and like frivolous kind of aspect to fighting that we would never, as modern readers, as modern viewers, take seriously nowadays, but back then it was, you know, it was still innovative and interesting. I think always in these books there's some really interesting characters and motivations for characters, and none of the characters are purely good or evil. There's always like extreme morally gray aspects to their personalities, which is interesting to read about and see developed, even if this book isn't as developed as the first one. This was the 12th book that I read in January, and that was the last book that I read in the month. I read 3 books of poetry, and I definitely hope that I'm in my poetry year, that I'm in a poetry time of life. I'm excited for that. I read 2 kind of English modern classics. I was able to finish a DNF, which is Howard's End by E.M. Forster. I was able to read my very first TBR spin book, and I really enjoyed it. I've been thinking about it more since I read it. I continued on in my cat cozy mystery reading, and you will see a cat cozy mystery vlog coming soon, coming out in February. I was able to read a work by an Indigenous author, and I listened to this on audio. I highly recommend it on audio. I think it was really well done. I was able to read a sci-fi classic. I read some works by people of color. I made really good progress on my Read What You Own. I was glad to read The Removed on audio, but also add a book to my Read What You Own challenge. I will be doing a Read What You Own check-in coming soon. So let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know if you read any poetry in January, or let me know what like year this is going to be for you. Like if this is going to be my poetry year, maybe it's your graphic novel year, or maybe it's your contemporary fiction year, or maybe it's your weird book year. Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, I will be doing a full readathon recap in a separate video. Look forward to that coming soon. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!